Hello.
Hi, Professor.
How's everybody doing today?
I'm glad it's Friday. Let's just say that.
Oh, wait, I didn't hear you.
I said, I'm glad it's Friday.
Oh, it's my fault. I didn't have my sound up. Say again.
I said, I'm glad it's Friday.
Oh, yeah, me too. I know why I didn't hear you.
Oh,
Does help to be plugged in. Well, not only is it Friday, can you hear me, by the way,
I
now?
can hear you.
Okay, good. Not only is it Friday, but we're gonna have to quit about 11:40 because I have a meeting I have to go to. Um, just as an aside, this is my wife and I are supposed to be, on March 1st, we're supposed to be the Masters of Ceremony at the Kirkwood High School Hall of Fame. And one of the persons who we're inducting into the Kirkwood High School Hall of Fame is Nikki Glazer. Do you know who I'm talking about? She was the host of the Grammys show. She's a stand-up comedian, and
okay. Yeah, I know who that is.
and pretty funny, pretty raunchy. About as opposite a person as my wife and I are. We've never actually been a masters of ceremony at anything. We've given public speeches, but never something like that. And we tried to beg our way out of it, but it didn't work. So we're stuck doing it. So we got to go. I have to go to a lunch where we're going to sort of rehearse what to do.
Well,
So we'll be.
congratulations. I think it's cool.
I
Anyway,
think you should get an autograph.
oh
Yeah.
yes.
Or get a photo if you can.
Do you think I have to have a joke?
Maybe.
Okay. Um, my youngest son was in her class um, in 2001 or 2000 thereabouts, and he says he used to say hi to her in the hall. That was the extent of his knowing about her. Anyway, okay, back to the Constitution and the founding fathers and etc. Um, does anyone have any questions about the course or any stories from the news that you brought in for extra credit or because they relate to what we're talking about?
I mean, the big thing yesterday was the new executive order, right? Keeping men out of women's sports. But that's
Right,
all I really got.
right. Which, I mean, it is an equality issue that um, the founding fathers weren't really thinking about. Of course, they weren't thinking about equality at all since there was no equality guaranteed in the Constitution. Uh, there was one, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, a famous one, all men are created equal, that actually did apply only to men and not all men. Not
Professor,
yes.
I just have a question. Like, has the US ever considered like creating like how men and women have play separate sports, right?
Yeah.
So have they considered making like a separate uh teams for transgender people, like only transgender people play in it, or like I'm just asking.
Well, I don't think that's been considered, but I don't know for sure. And um, um, I I mean this is an extremely good political issue for President Trump and for Republicans and a very fraught one for Democrats. I mean, I think it was there were, in the last days before the election, President Trump, or then candidate Trump, had gone to, I think it was a political rally in Princeton, New Jersey, to speak about this very issue of um, not allowing trans uh, people into women's events, sporting events, and there was a big response to that, and a lot of the um, of the social media influence messages related to the issue of uh, transgender athletics and transgender treatment uh, for minors. So, um, you know, I was watching. I don't know how many transgender athletes there are. There was this one particular case that got a lot of attention and sort of sparked this, and it was a transgender swimmer. Um, I think he might have been from the University of Pennsylvania, but I could be wrong about that, who was winning national races in women's events. And uh, that really got people interested. I don't know how many transgender uh, athletes want to compete in women's events. Does anyone know? I did see that Senator Durbin from Illinois was asking a question about this at a hearing with an NCAA head the other day, but I had the sound off on my phone and I didn't hear his answer. Does anybody have a clue?
I don't know how many compete. No. Do you know if SIU has any? Or
I don't know.
All
Um,
I can say is like I feel if ever a person shows like a very extraordinary athletic ability, they just treat it as a threat. Because I mean, if you link it to African Americans too, like some African Americans, like they were better, and there were like white people who saw them saw them as a threat at one point. So I feel like this is kind of like the same issue, but with transgender people now.
yeah, I mean, I feel like this is, I've never run into this. I was looking up how many transgender athletes there were, and I'm getting to the hill, and I get a thing on my screen saying, press and hold to confirm you're a human and not a bot.
Mhm.
That's never happened to me before. So NCAA president said there are fewer than 10 transgender athletes in college. NCAA President Charlie Baker told the Senate panel, I think this is the one, yeah, there was Durbin, that there are fewer than 10 transgender athletes he's aware of who currently compete in college, pouring cold water on an issue Republicans have said nationwide is a nationwide problem and one that's increasingly fraught territory for Democrats. Here, I'll put this clip in the. So what do you think? I mean, do you think that transgender athletes should be barred from women's sports because it's unfair uh, to women and they have an unfair advantage?
I think it's a sensitive subject. I mean, I watch my boys play sports with girls and they just run circles around them because they're all co-ed at like a young age. But I mean, everyone's really going to have like a really uh, an opinion on it, like whether or not like the hormone therapy works or reduces them or reduces their athletic ability. So it's hard. It's hard to know. I know for my daughter, I would like her to compete against girls and not transgendered. But yeah, I mean, it's an equality issue, but it's also a really sensitive subject for a lot of people because parents take sports serious. I mean, they take everything serious for their kids and they kind of want a level playing field. So I can kind of understand all the arguments around it.
Right. What do other people think?
I feel like it's wrong. Like this should be allowed, and like the scientific evidence as far as that goes, it's kind of like scattered, but like I feel like scientific evidence says it doesn't really matter, but I don't know, people's like general observation, as Joe said, like they think when they see that transgender perform better than women, so like in their opinion, they shouldn't be allowed. But as far as scientific evidence goes, I feel like science tells us that there's not much difference.
Other people have ideas?
I mean, I've discussed this extensively and heavily. I'm part of the LGBTQ constituency group here on campus, so we talk about issues like this a lot. Um, I would say, I think, in my personal opinion, things should be in weight categories like they do for boxing. So if you're in a certain weight category, you are able to compete against people in that similar weight class. I'm 6'2" and built like a train, and I could potentially compete against men of similar size to me, you know? So I think weight categories would eliminate a lot of the issues there.
Well, that would be an objective, sex-based category. So, I mean, this all involves Title IX, uh, which people always think about as primarily giving women equal. I mean, what it's most known for is giving women athletes more of an equal playing field. I mean, it's supposed to be an equal playing field, but I'm not sure we've gotten there yet. But there's been a huge amount of progress. And so Title IX is Title IX of the, by the way, if you're ever writing it, it's 1X, it's not the number nine. Uh, Title IX of the 1972 Education Amendments, and that bars sex discrimination in educational facilities, in educational facilities, in colleges um, and in high schools and all. It's not really just for sports; it's all educational opportunities. But back in the day, it was passed. The There was a huge disproportionate amount of attention being given to men's athletics. Um, the So the Biden administration interpreted Title IX as saying that transgendered people shouldn't be discriminated against in educational facilities, and now Trump has reversed that. Um, there's a case before the U.S. Supreme Court right now involving it's either Tennessee or Kentucky. I think I'll check it. Which has a law that bars transgender medical treatment for minors. Um, and let's see, I'm gonna look up SCOTUS blog here real quick. The case has been argued uh, before the Supreme Court, and it looked as though the justices might well um, rule in favor of the law. Um, hold a second. Okay, here it is. It's a Tennessee law. And so the Supreme Court had oral arguments on this in December. Um, and what the Tennessee law says bans gender-affirming medical treatments for transgender adolescents. Tennessee Senate Bill 1 bans healthcare providers from performing or offering to perform a medical procedure. This is a quote, a medical procedure if the performance or administration of the procedure is for the purpose of enabling a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with the minor's sex, treating purported discomfort or distress from a discordance between the minor's sex and asserted identity. The law provides some exceptions to this ban for procedures that address congenital defects, physical injuries, or are continuing treatment plan that started before the ban took place. It does not ban healthcare providers from performing gender-affirming medical procedures on cisgender minors, such as mastectomies for adolescent males diagnosed with gynecomastia. Here, I'll put that in the, so it appeared at the oral argument as though a majority of the Supreme Court was going to uphold that law that I just read. The one kind of surprising, I mean, I suspect the 3 democratically appointed justices would probably vote against it. I don't know for sure, but I think you could, that's what it seemed like from the arguments. The one person who I think didn't participate much in the argument, who is sometimes thought of as a possible vote on behavior, on issues of including transgendered people in protections against sex discrimination, is Justice Neil Gorsuch. He wrote an opinion, I don't know, it's about 4 years ago now, in which he said that the federal sex discrimination law, the word sex means sex. He's very much of a sort of, the words mean what they say, and that would include people of different sexual orientations and would include transgendered people as well. But he didn't seem to be taking that position in relation to Tennessee. So, you know, I tend to see it in terms of, and this is the way I tend to see the law on equal rights evolving over time, is that at the time of the Constitution, equality wasn't in the Constitution. Only it was a document written by rich white men, many of whom had slaves, and it didn't protect the right to vote. It didn't protect equality. It didn't include women. It didn't include blacks, and that in the years since then, there have been gradual increases in who is protected by the Constitution and who is entitled to equal rights. I mean, first it was because of the result of the 14th Amendment, equal protection was added to the Constitution after the Civil War. And then the Supreme Court read most of that protection out, particularly said persons protected by the 14th Amendment, that didn't protect women who wanted to vote or wanted to be lawyers from having no right to be admitted to the bar. That was an Illinois woman. And then 19th Amendment, we're in the 20th century here, you know, and ratified in 1920, only 100 years ago or so, extended the vote to women. Still, Southern segregation policies disenfranchised most Black women and men. Um, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, so we're talking, what, 60 years ago? And then about 10 years ago, the Chief Justice Robertson, his conservative majority on the Supreme Court began to read some of the protections out of the Voting Rights Act, which at one point had been one of the most popular civil rights laws to be passed. By 2000, there was no protection of same-sex marriage in any state of the union. Or 15 years later, it was a constitutional right. As I said, equal protection in the years after it was added to the Constitution didn't protect women, but gradually with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's lawsuits to the Supreme Court, equal protection was extended to protect against gender discrimination against both men and women. And so ended up providing the kind of protection that the Equal Rights Amendment would have provided had it been passed and ratified. It was passed. It wasn't. Well, there's an argument about whether it's ratified. So I just see that whole long line of history as providing broader and broader protection for groups that are minorities or on the outs or have been traditionally discriminated against in the United States. And so it's hard for me not to see the issue of transgender discrimination in that same lens, that this is just the next step. But that's my view. Any other thoughts from you all?
I think we can only solve this issue if we hear what the transgender people have to say about it. I mean, if we hear their arguments, we might find a solution. That's what I think. Because like we can debate on this all day, but we probably won't be able to find a good solution.
So what do you think the transgender people, what solution would they want? Would they want separate races? Is that what your suggestion is?
I don't know. Like that's the thing. I never got deeper into this issue, this transgender issue. So like as far as my like circle goes, like I haven't really met trans people gender up close, so I don't really know what they have to say about this.
Right. I mean, the idea of having separate races for transgendered persons sounds a little bit like separate but equal, which the Supreme Court once said was good enough to comply with equal protection of the 14th Amendment. That's the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which we'll study later in the class. Homer Plessy, who was one-eighth Black, wanted to buy a seat on a Louisiana railroad and was denied because of that one-eighth Black heritage. And that was sort of part of the one drop of blood makes you Black theory that segregationists followed in the day. And the Supreme Court said equal protection, to have separate but equal is just fine. So have a separate, fine to have a separate railroad car, fine to have a separate classroom, etc. That's equal protection. So it feels a little bit like that when you talk about separate races. But I mean, also to a certain extent, when you're talking about a total of 10 transgender athletes participating who want to participate in women's sports at the NCAA level, it feels a little bit like it's not a huge not a huge problem. I mean, I really don't. Does anyone know of any transgender athlete other than the swimmer who I think his name was Thomas, uh, who has had success at winning national contests
I,
for women?
I know about a Indian athlete. Let me look up her name though.
There was a transgendered skateboarder who won, I think it was just like a local competition competing against women. I'm gonna see if I can find it. This was like 4 or 5 years ago. I don't, let me see.
Leah Thomas was the swimmer I was trying to think of. I think the NCAA followed up Trump's executive order yesterday saying they would follow that, that they would follow that rule. NCAA changes transgender policy to limit uh, transgender women. There's a story about how 44 trans athletes have competed openly in college sports. Some have won medals, others have not. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's like a Daily Mail article and like a Piers Morgan article who, but just stating, I think Lillian Gallagher. It's hard to find like the actual competition. You have to like sift through Google's nonsense.
yeah, it is. I agree.
I don't see her name either. But I just read about it in my sociology class. Like there was this Indian athlete. She was barred from women's races. So she I don't know who she fought. I think it was the state government. Like like she fought it in the state court, and then she won won her argument, and she was allowed to play in women's sports, and eventually like she won the race.
Right. Let's see here.
Yeah, it was the Red Bull Cornerstone of 2021 that she won.
I mean, I don't believe, for example, that, yeah, so this is a list of, actually, here's Natalie Fahey is on this list of top 5 competitor for the Salukis in multiple events. She earned a top 10 finish in the MAC, I guess that's Mississippi Valley Championships as a junior in 2018. Um, she had started hormone prior to those championships. She had started hormone replacement therapy, and she swam in that year's Missouri Valley Conference Championship as an unscored exhibition swimmer. Let's see if there are any other. Squash, track and field, volleyball. I'll put this in the, I don't know if you're going to run into a block to reading this. I did one time and didn't the other time. These are the 44 trans people who have participated in sports. I think the most famous of which, the most successful of which was maybe Leah Thomas. Well, we'll see how it plays out. I mean, I would guess that that the executive order will be challenged in court. Um, and it may be that there'll be another Supreme Court case that interprets it the Title IX Trump order directly, and for which the Tennessee case that the Supreme Court is now considering could be a precedent they might rely on. Any other stories in the news?
I have something.
Shoot.
I was gonna talk about this one at the last class, but we ran out of time. So it's a little bit older. Remember how in the first in-person class we did, we talked about Leonard Peltier?
Oh yeah, I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought this up.
Yeah. So yeah, on the last day of Biden's presidency, he finally pardoned Peltier. And Peltier, for those of you who don't know who he is an indigenous activist who was wrongfully imprisoned for 50 years. I mean, wrongfully is debatable, but who was wrongfully imprisoned for 50 years for killing an FBI agent in association with AIM. And that was the American Indian Movement. And they are kind of like the native version of the Black Panthers. But natives have been protesting his release because there was really unreliable evidence that was brought forth that he was convicted on. And even the judge who convicted him recently said that he made a mistake and that he shouldn't have been put away. And another fun fact about that is Peltier was actually held in Marion for a number of years, and there were people here in the 90s protesting, trying to have him released. And after 50 years, he finally gets to go home. He's an elderly, ill man now, and at least he gets to spend that last time with his family.
So what was he convicted of?
Killing an FBI agent. But there was a material witness who claimed to have saw him do it, but she proved to be unreliable, and they still counted that. And there was no actual evidence other than that to link him to the shooting. Basically, the FBI agents were investigating AIM and their activities, and there ended up being a shootout. And this woman claimed that Peltier was the one who did it. But I have other information that I probably shouldn't share out loud. It's kind of a known thing within Native communities that he couldn't have done it because he was attempting to commit a crime elsewhere. And yes, with a group of people for AIM, and they were pulled over by the police for a speeding ticket. And so they never accomplished that what they were setting out to do. So that was proof that he couldn't have done it because he was with these individuals at the time. And the person who was with him in that vehicle was a professor in, I think, Washington or North Dakota, somewhere up north, who told my current boss that he was with Peltier that night.
Is that right?
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I guess that wasn't introduced as evidence because it would be admission to another crime.
Yes.
And this is what at a was this at a Wounded Knee protest?
I'm not sure because there was a massacre at Wounded Knee. We're not talking about the old one. There was one
Right.
in the 70s that happened. And I think there was a lot of like ramped up AIM activity after that. So I don't know if it was directly pinpointed as that, but it definitely could have been related.
Right. And there have been efforts to pardon or commute a sentence
Yes, for 50 years,
for
like
50
so many
years.
times. Yep.
Let's see, I'm just looking up. Convicted of killing 2 FBI agents in 1975 at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. It occurred during a confrontation between FBI AIM activists and the FBI. Let's see. So was he given a pardon or was it commuted?
I heard pardoned, but I don't know that for sure.
I think you're right, but I didn't read it carefully enough. Um, I'll look it up here real quick. So here's, I'll put in the chat. This looks like it's facts put out by those who wanted him to be pardoned. Um, commutes. Let's see here. One of the last acts of President Biden before he left office was to commute the sentence of jailed indigenous activist Leonard Pelletier, serving 2 life sentences um, in prison half a century, 1975 killings of 2 FBI agents. He's now 80 and in declining health. So here's AP story on that. Yeah, I was I sort of was paying a little bit of attention to that because I think maybe hadn't you brought that up in one of the earlier classes?
Yeah, it was the pizza party
Oh, the pizza party for 2,
for
right?
2 people. Yeah.
Yeah, my lone student who came to the pizza party. Okay. Uh,
Free
anybody
food, man.
free food? It was pretty good pizza too. Anybody else have stories in the news? Um, I mean, I would since the subject of this class is equal justice. I would just make sort of the overall observation, and matter of fact, I'll send you a piece I wrote about this yesterday. Um, the overall observation that President Trump has is using diversity, equity, and inclusion, which you might as well just read as you know, blacks and gays and women, uh, as a scapegoat for a lot of things where there's no facts that back up his claims. The air crash over D.C., the fires in California and Los Angeles, etc. And which I think which to my eye is particularly ironic when at the same time he is nominated for some of the most important parts of his cabinet, people who, well, it's the least qualified cabinet that I've ever seen. I think it's the least qualified cabinet in the history of the country. You know, the idea that this Fox News guy with sexual allegations and drunkenness allegations against him and who has never run any bureaucracy can run a bureaucracy the size of the Pentagon. And then the FBI director who's spent all his time talking about the deep state and um, Pam Bondi, election denier. Um, she was Attorney General of Florida. Um, and Robert F. Kennedy, top health official who denies, um, who, questions vaccinations of fluoride in toothpaste. I mean, you juxtapose the war on DEI and using DEI as a scapegoat with the lack of qualifications of the people he has appointed to his cabinet is pretty shocking. you can count that under as an editorial. And meanwhile, Congress is, because Congress is controlled by Republicans who are under Trump's sway. If you raise any questions, as one, I think, a Louisiana senator did about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., you have Elon Musk threatening to lead a lead an online assault on you, or online campaign against you. So you have the various checks and balances that the Constitution provides. I mean, one of the really strongest points about the Constitution, this doesn't really relate to equal rights, but are the checks and balances that there are various branches of government check each other's exertions of too much power. In a ideal world where the Constitution was working the way it was meant to work, you would have Congress checking, which has power of the purse, the power to decide how to spend money. You'd have Congress checking these executive actions of Trump's to abolish whole programs like USAID that were for which money was appropriated by Congress. So you'd have a check from Congress. The courts are supposed to be a check on both the Congress and the president. But this is all moving so fast that the legal issues haven't gotten teed up to the Supreme Court yet. And even when they do, this is such a conservative Supreme Court that where many of the conservatives are persuaded by a kind, are in the sway of a unitary executive form of government that would give lots more power to the president. It might be that the Supreme Court won't provide a check. And then meanwhile, the other constitutional check on power, the press, protected by the First Amendment, is intimidated to the extent that you've got Disney and ABC spending $16 million, or paying $16 million to Trump's library because of a defamation suit filed against George Stephanopoulos for saying that Trump had raped Jean Carroll, when the judge in the case actually said on the court record that he digitally raped Jean Carroll. The jury had found that he sexually assaulted her, but hadn't met the California criminal burden of proof for criminal rape. And then you have Paramount, even a more outrageous case. You have Paramount that owns CBS, which is thinking about trying to settle a suit where Donald Trump claimed $10 billion, that's with a B, dollars in damages because of the way 60 Minutes edited its pre-election interview with Kamala Harris. 60 Minutes always invites the presidential candidates to a 60 Minutes interview, and Trump refused to appear. Kamala Harris was asked a question about the Middle East and whether or not Netanyahu was listening to Biden, was essentially the Bill Whitaker question. CBS used part of her longish answer as a promo for the 60 Minutes interview. The promo was on Face the Nation, and then they broadcast part of her answer as part of the 60 Minutes broadcast. These are standard editing techniques. The thought that this would be actionable in court, much less that this would involve a $10 billion injury. um, is absurd. Yet the because of the economic considerations that Paramount feel, they want to try to sell Paramount, and the economic pressures that Disney feels. So they want to get rid of this lawsuit involving the newly elected president. They're they're not even exercising the legal prerogatives that they have in court. I mean, it's the Stephanopoulos case was a defamation suit, so New York Times versus Sullivan precedent from 1964 requiring a public official to prove actual malice, reckless disregard for the truth would be in play, and it would seem as though President Trump would not have a very strong case. And I'm not the only First Amendment lawyer to take that position. Anyway, if you all have any thoughts on that, glad to hear them. Feel free to disagree with me. Matter of fact, if you disagree with me, or if you agree with me, I'll give you credit for participation.
I have too many thoughts to put into words,
Okay.
but I generally agree with you.
Okay, anything else on these amazing times that we are living in and how they might affect the subject of this course on equality before the law? Let's turn back to the founding period. Make sure that you have read the piece that's in the piece that's on the reading list about all of the rights that we might sometimes think were in the Constitution as written that weren't in there. Yeah, it's from the Journalism Review article I wrote on that subject. Basically, democracy, the right to vote, the Bill of Rights were not in the original Constitution. The summary, I mean, you should know all the information that's in the summary at the top of in the discussion list, what was left out of the Constitution, week 1 and 2. So the headline of that story that I want you to make sure you read: democracy, equality, privacy, blacks, women, the right to vote. All that was left out of the original Constitution. So I mean, there are to give even though all those things were left out of the Constitution, and we'll talk about why. Even though all those things were left out of the Constitution still, I think, stands as I would say, as an amazing Enlightenment document of the sovereignty of people instead of popes and potentates and kings and queens, to be this sovereign control of a government, in this case a representative republic, and that those very first words, "we the people," which have, I mean, they have a democratic ring to them, but they're not really enforceable. They're not saying, not like putting into the Constitution equality, or all men are created equal. None of those things. That wasn't in the Constitution. But we the people is a statement of that the people are the sovereign. And you know, even Chief Justice Roberts, in the decision he wrote earlier this year, giving broad immunity from presidents, particularly Trump, for official acts while president. Um, I mean, his opinion ends with no one's above the law. He actually puts puts the president above the law for a lot of their activities. But uh, even in sort of the most recent statement that gives extraordinary immunity to the president, there is that principle that no one is above the law. Uh, there's also, different ways of arguing whether or not the whether or not the Constitution is pro-slavery or anti-slavery. On the one hand, the people who say it's anti-slavery point out that it never uses the word slavery. The people who and that wasn't by chance, that was by intention. The people who say that it's pro-slavery point out, well, about 3 paragraphs into the Constitution is the Three-Fifths Compromise. It doesn't mention the word slavery, but it gives extra political power to people in the South, and clearly is not providing any kind of a franchise for free blacks or for enslaved blacks. It allows the slave trade to continue into the 19th century. It provides for the return of fugitive people directed at enslaved people. And so there are, and most certainly the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was compromised over slavery. There were a number of people who wanted stronger document against slavery, but they couldn't have had a constitution if they did that. So
I just heard that like
go ahead.
whatever like laws they passed, they had a good reason for it. Like a lot of people like argue that why didn't they allow all white men to vote, for instance, or why did they, pass the Three-Fifths Compromise? So like the first argument that right, why didn't they allow all white people to vote, all white men, only white landowners, was well, like one of the founders, I don't remember his name. He gave the reasoning that back then landlords were the ones that had an education, whereas the ones that didn't have an education. Basically, white people, they came as indentured. Well, I don't remember the exact name, but they came as servants as well, right? They were free.
Indentured servants is what they
Yeah,
were called. Yeah.
yeah. So like, they became free after they completed their contract. So basically, most of them didn't have an educational degree. That's what one of the founding fathers said. That this is one of the reasons why they were barred in the beginning from voting, because they felt like they would make the wrong decision. Like they would vote for people who shouldn't be voted for, basically. And like gradually, when people started having an education degree, that's when it was decided, okay, let's allow them to vote. And the second reason, like the Three-Fifths Compromise, was like
So was that a good reason?
in my opinion, I think what they wanted was like people not making bad decisions, which kind of made sense because like
So
if you want.
should we have literacy tests today and only allow people who can answer a basic uh, civics test to
I
vote?
mean, you have a point there. Like I don't know. Like I'm not saying like they should know ABC basically. And honestly, that literacy test was pretty hard. I saw one of them. Yeah. So like no, I'm not saying they should have a educational degree. I think like if we change that around a little bit, not exactly saying educational degree. If we just say that if they understood what's going on, then they should have allowed them to vote. So I mean, I'm just like stating one of the reasons basically.
Right.
And like I won't say I agree entirely, nor do I disagree. I'm just saying they gave a reason that I don't know. It may have made sense back then, maybe. So like, yeah. So that's one of the reasons they gave, and then the three-fifths compromise. That was also a reason they gave was that they wanted the North and the South both to agree to the Constitution, so they had to make that compromise, so the South would vote for it. So that I'm just saying, I'm just giving the reasons behind all of that.
Right. Well, they were, I mean, all 55 of the framers were white men. You know, no women, nobody who wasn't white. Almost all were wealthy. 13 owned slaves, and that included three of the first four presidents.
And
Uh,
like if we think about it, Professor, like even now, like I read about it, America isn't exactly a democracy. It's a representative democracy. So even the people we vote for today are still people who are qualified. So we still like even though like you just said, even though we've been, we now agree that people don't need to have an educational degree to vote, we still believe that they should have an educational degree to be on Congress. So, like, I feel like we still believe in those principles, even if the majority of America doesn't. I believe they still believe that in the government sector. Like, you need to have an educational degree to know what's going on in Congress.
well, why don't we require a little bit more in the way of qualifications from people who are going to head the cabinet, if we really believe in
True.
that? Uh, but I mean, you're right in saying that uh, that the reasons that the founding fathers didn't want to extend the franchise even to all white men is they thought a lot of them weren't qualified. They were very worried about democracy. There was a very much of an anti-democratic feeling. And yes, we don't still have, even though if you asked anybody in a presidential debate, do we have a democracy? They'd all say yes. But in fact, we don't. Think about the people who have been elected president just this century. Two of the people who got the most popular votes didn't win the election, Al Gore and Hillary Clinton. If we had democracy, the person who got the most votes would win. Um, so, um, I mean, you're making good points. So all of these people were wealthy. Many of them plantation owners who owned slaves. Jefferson referred to the men in Philadelphia as demigods because he thought they were so smart. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, George Mason were amongst the most well-known. Jefferson wasn't there because he was in France, and John Adams was in England, was in Great Britain, so they weren't present at the Constitutional Convention. Um,
And Professor, you brought the question of literacy test. I just wanted to say, like,
yeah,
the whole law was unfair because the reason people say it's unfair isn't was because it was only imposed on African Americans. It wasn't imposed on white people. As far as I read the arguments, that was the argument. Like, if you're barring illiterate people, then bar all of them. It was only barring African Americans.
well, that's true. I mean, literacy tests were used in the South in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to bar blacks from voting. They give them all sorts of like tricky question tests about the Constitution, and then they would not allow them to vote. So yes, literacy tests were terribly abused. And don't get me wrong, I think everybody should be able to vote. I'm not favoring. I'm not favoring a literacy
You're not
test.
pro Jim Crow laws?
I'm not pro Jim Crow. Put me down as anti Jim Crow. Uh, Philip Kurland was a University of Chicago professor and wrote us about the Constitutional Convention. And he said the Constitution was unique in that it was a government which looks to the people as sovereign and distributes authority between central power and states. Um, Women were citizens, but they had no thought of giving women rights, even though Abigail Adams wrote it to her husband. quote, "In the new code of laws, I desire you remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." John Adams thought she was joking. Uh, um, the people at the Constitutional Convention, um, uh, actually, Constitutional Convention sort of went out of control. They were sent there to improve the Articles of Confederation, which is what the country was being governed by not very well. But then they decided to write a constitution instead. Um, some people even thought the Constitution was unconstitutional because they didn't have the authority to write a constitution. Only property men could vote in most states. 85% of Americans couldn't vote under the new constitutional design. They didn't really want a democracy. Their deliberations were secret, although James Madison kept notes. But they often spoke in those deliberations about the excesses of democracy that they showed all around them. There had just been something called the Shays Rebellion of Debtors in Massachusetts, which is an armed revolt put down shortly before the Constitutional Convention that was seen as a reason for a stronger central government and for less democracy. Alexander Hamilton, so there were three, you sometimes have heard of the Federalist Papers, which were published under the name Publius as a defense of ratifying the Constitution. They were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. So Hamilton, one of the three authors, spoke openly of his distaste for democracy. He said popularly elected governments were, quote, but pork, still with a little change of sauce. He wanted lifetime terms for the president and senators. Of course, the Senate was originally not directly elected. It wasn't until, I don't know, 1912, 13, 14, 15, somewhere in that period that there was a constitutional amendment providing for direct election of senators. Before that, state legislatures chose the senators. If you look at Missouri senators right now, they're probably the people the state legislature would choose. Let's see, Madison, another Federalist author and a reliable note taker, said he was worried about the, quote, leveling spirit alive in some state legislatures. And the founding fathers were more interested in the debts of farmers. That some of the state legislatures, Madison thought, were more interested in the debts of farmers than the rights of established property owners. Roger Sherman of Connecticut wanted the state legislatures, rather than the people, to choose the House. The people should have as little to do, this is Sherman's quote, the people should have as little to do as may be about the government. They want information and are constantly liable to be misled. Charles Pinckney, South Carolina, said people could not be trusted because the majority of people in South Carolina are notoriously for paper money and legal tender. Elbridge Gerry, after whom the gerrymanders named, from Massachusetts, said the evils we experience from the flow of excess democracy. The worst men get into the legislatures. Benjamin Franklin couldn't attend a lot of the sessions. He was the strongest voice for democracy. He poked fun at those unwilling to trust the common man. He said, it seems to have been imagined by some that returning to the mass of the people was degrading the president. In other words, not having a lifetime term for the president. In free governments, the rulers are the servants, and the people their superiors and sovereigns. For the former, therefore, to return amongst the latter is not to degrade, but to promote them. Didn't include the right to vote because they were opposed to universal suffrage and wanted to limit the vote to property holders. Historian Charles Beard wrote an economic interpretation of the Constitution that the business and financial interests of the framers made them immediately and directly and personally interested in and deriving political economic advantages from establishing the new system. Leonard Levy is a historian about the Constitution. He said the Constitution was not an undemocratic document, was more democratic than the Articles of Confederation, and did not impede the development of democracy. But the claim that the Constitution itself was a democratic document strains the evidence. Only 10 to 15% of the population owned property at the time of the Constitution, so only they were able to vote in most states. Slaves composed 20% of the population and were considered not as property, not people. White servants were about 10% of the population. They were considered chattel and could not vote or drink in a tavern. Native Americans were not citizens. 10% of the white males who were free to acquire property but didn't have any. In most states, they couldn't vote. Women ceased to exist when they were married. She and her spouse became only the flesh, and the flesh was his, is the way one person described it. But I think it is important to recognize that while it didn't set up a democracy and it wasn't a democratic document, that it has provided put the people in charge, and has over time, sometimes requiring the help of a civil war in which 500,000 men were killed. It has improved over time with the 14th Amendment, protecting liberty and equal protection on the blood of the Civil War, the early 20th century amendments on direct election of the Senate and giving women the right to vote, and then the whole civil rights era of getting rid of racial segregation and providing equal rights and expanding the franchise. So we're a work in progress. I don't know which direction we're going right now. I mean, one could argue on the pessimistic side of things that after basically 220 years or so of gradually expanding democracy and freedoms, that there are beginning to be some steps back in the other direction. I mean, the Dobbs decision on abortion is definitely took constitutional rights away from half of the population. Not that all of the women wanted to exercise those rights, and the way in which laws relating to transgender people are sweeping the country. I mean, like 25 legislatures have bans on transgender care. They are again moving away from the idea of equality for all sexual classifications. Sort of the arc of progress that Martin Luther King and Barack Obama used to talk about, always bending towards progress, may not be right now. What do you all think?
I don't think we're really progressing forward, at least, or not expanding. We're taking a lot of steps back. It's really interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, these are interesting times. What do other people think?
I think it's meant to be shock and awe and demoralizing. I think the current administration is testing the limits to see what they can get away with and what they can't. Um, but other than that, I don't really know what's going on. I'm just surviving like the rest of us, I guess.
Um, so if you look at, if you compare and contrast um, um, Hannah Jones' 1619 project with uh, President Trump's 1776 report, which do you think is a more accurate description of the development of equality and and the place of the Constitution and the founding uh, in that uh, uh, which is the more accurate history?
Before I spout off, I'll give somebody else the opportunity because I remember I stayed up all night reading that the one night.
Well, we're happy to hear you spout off, but I'm happy to hear other people spout off as well.
Like, I think I said it last time. I think the 1776 really touches on a lot of, I guess we could say right wing or left wing, what people like is like being shown to people right now, whereas the 1619 doesn't really touch on that. So if you like social media, depending on what social media, they're like talking about teaching in America, critical race theory. It's really focused on things that are happening now in the present, at least later on, further down in the document. And obviously, like it talks about fascism and communism. Um, and I think a lot of those things over the last 4 years, they made a lot of headway with pushing those narratives. And so the document definitely like appeals to the people who think that way on fascism, progressivism, and communism, whereas the 1619 doesn't really focus on like now, like the time, like what it's like, what's going on currently. Whereas there's like ideas like when they like talk about, I had to pull it up when she talks about like the war veterans and things like that. And then it just seems like it's more set in the past where one's more like combating the present or like telling about the present. And obviously there's struggles in both ways, but that's just my opinion on it.
Well, I mean, I think you have a couple of good points there. I mean, one of the things that was striking to me when I read the 1776 report, and it seemed to me to be a little bit off base, was this idea that progressives were actually fascists, uh, and and they were part of this sort of special interest kind of democracy, and um, I I mean, I guess there have been a lot of claims on the other hand that that Trump is promoting the sort of an autocracy or oligarchy, or maybe it's a kleptocracy, considering how much money he made uh, on his medallion that around the time of his inauguration, the billions of dollars he was able to make on that. But Yeah, and Nicole Hannah Jones was, I mean, I think her main point, and I thought it was a point that was well taken, was that the story uh, of inequality and slavery and um, discrimination and against Black people was at the center of uh, of American history from start to finish. Um, I mean, the founding fathers uh, were debating um, about slavery. Um, then we'll get to in the next classes, we'll get to the whole 1800s where there's all these, where Congress, some of the most important things that Congress did was to try to compromise the slavery issue. The first of those attempts to compromise being um, the Missouri Compromise in 1821 and 22. Um, and then the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Bill. All these are attempts to compromise the slavery issue and whether or not slavery can continue into the territories. And then the Dred Scott decision of 1857 that led to the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, uh, where, the national conversation leading up to the Civil War is, do black people have rights that white people even have any kind of necessity of respecting? Chief Justice Taney saying no, Lincoln saying yes. Uh, the Civil War, then Reconstruction, taking newly given rights away from black people, narrowly interpreting the 14th Amendment's equality provisions. Um, the whole period of Ku Klux Klan and hundreds of lynchings, race riots in East St. Louis, uh, and other big cities around the country, racial segregation, um, the 1954 Brown decision, and civil rights decisions of the Supreme Court and civil rights legislation of the 60s that followed, the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and then moving on to more women's rights, Title IX in 1972, recognizing rights of women to control their bodies in Roe, and to get birth control in Griswold versus Connecticut, and then extending equality to same-sex individuals and constitutional equality and same-sex couples. I mean, the theme of expanding equality and the centrality of slavery, segregation, discrimination, and civil rights to American history is it seems to me is sort of a point well taken. What do you think?
I, I think there's a lot of good points, honestly. Like, and I was just reviewing the document, so yeah. I mean, obviously, we're not in a point of expansion right now, and I just think the 1776 sticks to the narrative, however wrong it is, that it's trying to push. I mean, it's not. I feel like it's targeted more towards the people who would enjoy or like represent that side, and not so much the other, like the left, when you read it.
Yes, I would definitely agree with you. One thing I left out of the founding era is that Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence actually criticized the king for slavery. It said, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in persons of a distant people who never offended him, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain his execrable commerce. But that got cut out.
Right, and I think like both documents touch on that. Like I think the 1770, not they don't like say that exactly, states that like right in the beginning that slavery wasn't like solely an American sin, right?
Right. Well, that's right. I mean, I guess though it wasn't solely an American sin, and there was certainly the trade in slaves was affected was engaged in by a number of European countries, Great Britain, uh, the Netherlands, and others. I guess maybe Spain engaged in, I don't know, it's maybe slavery involving um, Native Americans or um, so yes, it wasn't just an American sin, although it was America that fought a revolution about it. Other thoughts?
I think if you take away the political nature of both of those documents, they're actually really insightful for understanding how these groups think and what their plans are and how they envision um, our country, our nation. You know, the 1776 report is really an inside view of what Trump and his administration want because they are implementing a lot of things based around the findings that they came up with in the 1776 report today. Um, but I think more so than just being focused on the past, Hannah Nicole Jones and the 1619 Project are trying to like, okay, this is the view that you have had for hundreds and hundreds of years. We understand that, but you are excluding so many others who contributed to the history, the shared history of the United States, including Black people, including Native Americans, who had to be forcefully removed, who had to die in a genocide in order for your expansion to even happen. And I think it's trying to get that white centric American exceptionalism view to make room for other histories because we are a very diverse nation and we don't always get that perspective, like on a grand scale at least.
Right. Um, Alexander Hamilton wrote that without the slavery compromise, no union could possibly have been formed. Um, uh, see, Luther Martin of Maryland at the Constitutional Convention proposed a tax on the importation of slaves, calling slavery inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution. John Rutledge of South Carolina responded, religion and humanity had nothing to do with the question. Interest alone is the governing principle of nations. If northern states consult their interest, they will not oppose the increase of slaves, which will increase the commodities of which they will become carriers. George Mason, who is a plantation owner uh, from Virginia, gave the most prescient speech about slaves. He said, slaves, quote, bring a judgment of heaven on a country. As the nation cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. But an inevitable chain of causes and effects, by an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punished national sins by national calamities. I think he foresaw the Civil War. Um, Other thoughts? I mean, Jefferson is sort of an interesting person because on the one hand, he wrote, all men are created equal. And he did want to put a provision in the Declaration of Independence about slavery. And he, believe, was uh, was the person who put into the Northwest Ordinance, which organized, the states of like Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan, that area, an anti-slavery provision. Um, but, at the same time, he had all these slaves, led this secret life of having a whole family with Sally Hemings. I mean, it wasn't until modern DNA uh, that the proof was found that that was true. I mean, the Jefferson family had denied it for centuries, but then there was the irrefutable proof. Um, so, he's this um, this eloquent stater of all of these principles of equality, and yet his personal life um, didn't live up to them.
The funny thing about Jefferson is that I don't know if you know this, was that he said to Africans that if like you can go back to Africa and that there you'll get equal rights, like in America, white people will get equal rights. That's what he meant. Like he said, America is for white people. Here, white people get equal rights. If the Africans go to Africa, they'll get equal treatment there. And he had this whole movement set up where African Americans are allowed to go back to Africa. Uh,
Well, I mean, the person I associate with that in particular is Abraham Lincoln. And when he was in the White House fighting the Civil War, he invited black leaders to the White House to try to persuade them that that was the way to deal with this, is to uh, provide for passage back to Africa. He didn't get a very positive response. Uh,
Yeah, I
from,
mean, they obviously these people, most of them, especially even in Jefferson's time, they were born in America. Some of them lived most of their lives. So how can you just make them go back?
right. Um, so, Jeffrey, you can't really, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get to the Civil War, but you can't really describe uh, Lincoln before. I mean, Lincoln really only qualified. Uh, you can't qualify Lincoln as an abolitionist. You can't describe him accurately as an abolitionist until anytime sooner than January 1st, 1863, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And even then, that only freed enslaved people in the South, not in the not in the uh, not in the border states. And um, you might even argue that it wasn't until the ratification of the 13th Amendment banning slavery in the whole nation, which he was very influential in getting passed in Congress, but which was only, I think, ratified maybe a week before he was assassinated, that he entirely qualifies as an abolitionist. He said in his first inaugural speech that he wasn't trying to get rid of slavery, he's just trying to keep it from being extended in the territories. That's what the pre-Civil War fight was all about. It wasn't about freeing enslaved people. It was about keeping slavery from expanding. Theoretically, the Dred Scott case, the Dred Scott case, um, what Lincoln feared could even cause some non-slave states to enact slavery, or some of the border states to do so. Um, So he was just trying to keep slavery from expanding. He didn't think that blacks and whites should marry. He didn't think blacks should be on juries. He didn't think blacks should be able to vote. At the time of the Lincoln Douglas debates in 1858. It's a little discouraging to see him trying to defend himself against Stephen Douglas saying, "Oh, he wants blacks and whites to be able to marry. He allows a young white woman to ride in the carriage along with Frederick Douglass at his on his way to the debates." And he finds himself on the defensive, trying to say, "No, that's not what I want." So he was heartily arguing for equality as late as the Lincoln Douglas debates. And so that's what we'll move on to for next time. Has anyone gotten in a notion of what they want to do for their project? That they'd like to run past us and see if anybody has any thoughts about it. Remember, I'm looking for something like a 10, 15 page paper, uh, research paper. I'm not looking for footnotes. I'm looking for, but I do want references. And that then you'll present the class towards the end of the semester. I'm welcoming debates if one person wants to take one side of an issue, another side, whether it be transgender rights or whatever.
Professor,
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, like you said, 15-page paper. Is it double spaced or is it not double spaced?
I hadn't thought through that.
Because then it would be a lot, I mean.
Um, let's do it in words. I'm looking for like 2,000 to 3,000, 2,000 to 2,500 words.
Is it like just a specific subject, or is it just like ethics and?
So a subject involving equality under law.
All right.
So pretty broad possibilities. I mean, you could just you could say you were going to just write about the 1917 race riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, or you could write about how Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legal career and career as a justice expanded women's rights, or just focus in on how she used cases in which men were being discriminated against to read more equality into equal protection that then extended equal rights to women. Lots of different possibilities, of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What the case on each side of that. We certainly could have a debate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, is it expanding equality, or is it discriminating against white males who feel like they're excluded from discussions and DEI initiatives? So lots of different possibilities. Just mull it over. We're not in a rush here. We got a lot of time before May. We'll have these debates and presentations towards the end of the course. Any other thoughts or questions?
Did you say this was due in May?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
first week of May is it's due by final exam week, which I think.
And then are you going to be posting directions for it on D2L?
I think it's on the syllabus, but yeah, I don't think I've got into like number of words. I'll make sure I get all that down.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Vicky. Okay. See you all next week. We'll talk about, I'll send you a note along with the link to the YouTube recording of this session, but we'll be basically talking about the period of time in the early 19th century leading up to the war. Make sure that you have read about the Dred Scott case and the Lincoln Douglas debates, which are recreated in the 1857 project that's linked to in your syllabus. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye bye.